In the first one, we'll go in the downward stroke, and I'll do this about 10 or 15 times and show you exactly about how much tension and force should be on it. As you can see, I'm keeping the curve in my lower back as I do that and not putting the pelvic in a forward tilted position. We want to enhance the normal curves in the spine and download just enough to open up the leaves of the spring. And that's how the first exercise is done. In my own situation, I do that about 100 strokes. 30 to 60 is an ideal range. Now what we're going to do is to go into the downward stroke, and we're going to bend from side to side. We don't have to have the elbows against the wall for this one here. We can bring them in against our body for a little bit more stability and strength. And again, with the tongue and the frenulum and the pelvis in such a way so that we keep all the curves in the spine, we're going to laterally flex. And we're going to sort of pivot the chin on the bar without sliding it so that we can bend the cervical spine again around that apex or pivot point in the cervical curve, back and forth. And you'll notice that one spring elongates more than the other as you go to that side. And again, 30 to 60 repetitions. And as you become more and more comfortable with it and feeling more safe, you can put as much pressure as you want on it. That's simply a level of comfort and also familiarity. Now, the third exercise that would be done is again with the elbows more in toward the body, and we're going to get the chin on the bar, but we're going to pull down a little harder so that the chin is not touching the bar. The bar is pulled away from the chin in order to allow for rotation of the head through its full ranges of motion, again with controlled pivot point in the middle of the cervical curve. And as you can see, I have a pretty good downward pressure. This is a very dynamic rehab protocol, but it's actually quite simple as well. About anybody can do it, young to old. And again, the tongue should be on the frenulum. Now the next exercise that is done, we're going to be a little bit more assertive in this one here, and we're going to put the bar up on the forehead with the curved bar up underneath the skull. So the straight bar is on the forehead, the curved bar is up underneath the skull. We're going to go into the downward position in such a way that the toes, knees, and elbows are on the floor. Tongue and the frenulum, and the bite line should be kept perfectly straight. We're going to go downward, 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 downward. This really is going to go and open up the joints all the way into the lumbar spine, down to the lumbosacral spine. And the rocking motion of the hips will put the lumbar spine through flexion extension ranges of motion with traction at the same time. Now, in an ideal situation, because of the predominance of fixed extension of the skull, we could do a very, very controlled rehabilitation program to retrain the skull and C0, C1 articulation to go back into flexion during this protocol, so we could sort of kill two birds with one stone. Unlocking the skull, which is so prevalent in our culture, would be simply done with a little bit of tension on the lines or springs, and with the tongue and the frenulum going into the chin tucking motion, where you bring the chin really right up into the throat. This isolates the articulations and forces the C0, C1, C1, C2, and C3, C4 going into inflection, opening them up on the back. Now again, one controls this with how much comfort that they can have and how much load they can incur. So in this situation, I'm not putting a lot of tension, enough tension to make it work, and running it through ranges of motion. And because I've been doing it for so many years, I can put a tremendous amount of load and go into a very, very huge amount of flexion, okay, with my entire body weight on it. Now, as we're doing this, as I said, we're working on opening up the articulations in the lumbar spine and putting them into distraction or cyclical loading. We could do this by taking the pelvis and going through ranges of motion, again around arcs of motion. Reason for this is because in the cervical spine, the head pivots on the pivotal point in the mid-cervical spine, and the rib cage is fixed because of the buttressing of the entire rib cage, and the lumbar pivot point, that's how the pelvis functions off the thoracic cage. And so we would want to put that range of motion clockwise and counterclockwise while we're distracting the lumbar spine to create not only opening up the disc, but directional stresses on all the different directions of ligamentous fiber orientations in the intervertebral discs. And that obviously would work the paraspinal soft tissues rather well as well. And if I, on the forward stroke, do chin tucks, now I can work the entire system through this rehabilitation program or protocol and cause ranges of motion as well as distraction hugely around the lumbar spine while I train skull to go into flexion on the forward stroke. Okay. And again, in the very, very advanced stage, I've been doing it again for many, many years, you could do this with your entire body weight, which would cause huge amount of traction on this spine.